Now, what is very interesting is that if you look at the geography of religion in China, the Muslims are the largest religious minority in China. In the past and in the present, there was a small Jewish presence. And many of those Jews who lost their numbers in China among the Hui Chinese became Muslim Huis. So they become Muslims. Because their numbers were getting smaller, they joined the Muslim minority group because they were seen by the Chinese as barbarians. All these non-Chinese were barbarians. Now, the Hui Chinese are the offsprings of Han Chinese who intermarry with other groups. There are other Muslims who were not Chinese, they were Turkish, Muslim of Turkish background. The Uyghurs, the Kazakhs. Now, these were conquered. There were some Iranians who were brought as slaves into China. And of course, this was before Islam. And many of those people would be instrumental because they pass some of the knowledge, decorative art knowledge that you find in China. And many of those Chinese brought the Central Asians into the area. So when you have the Ming dynasty and the Manchu dynasty, those Chinese who were ruling, these Ming and the Manchu dynasties were considered barbarians by the Chinese because they were not Han Chinese. Now many of us don't appreciate, we see a Chinese is a Chinese, but they are different. They are different. Just like in Africa, you see one African, don't think that all Africans are like him. I mean, you have Africans, you have Africans, you have Africans. So they're different. The same thing with the Chinese. But the Chinese, the Han Chinese, they knew themselves. They knew that, and they could differentiate between themselves and the other groups that existed. Now, what is very interesting for us as students of Muslim Islamic history in China is that as a result of the coming to power of the Ming dynasty and the Manchu dynasty, those Muslims among the Han Chinese, or those Muslims who were the offspring of Han marriages with non-Han among the Turkish-speaking people, were now used cleverly by the Chinese ruling group as border guards. They used them at the border. Why is that? Because these Hui Chinese, who were mixed Chinese and Turkish, could be more effective at the border in dealing with their cousins who are Turkish than the full-blooded Han Chinese. And this would lead to the scattering of the Muslims. And of course, the Muslims have this concept of the Murabitun, those who were the border guards in Islamic history. So, I mean, like the Murabitun, so those who are the defenders of the Ribat. Now, the interesting thing here really is that these Muslim Hui Chinese who were used as bodyguards were scattered by these varying dynasties in the border. And this will account for the dispersal of Muslims throughout China. Another way in which Muslims came into China in big ways was that many of those Central Asian Turkish groups were recruited by the ruling dynasties, especially the Mongols. Once the Mongols took over China, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, remember they ran into China and wiped out the dynasties there and created their own dynasty. And then, of course, they destroyed Baghdad in 1258. And of course, that affected the history of Muslims for the last 600, 700 years. Now, in the Chinese context, the Mongol invasion of China resulted in the planting of more Muslims. That's the irony. They destroyed Baghdad and they wiped Muslim power. But in order for these Mongols to rule the Chinese, the Han Chinese, they needed Muslim collaborators. So the British did the same thing, like in other parts of the world. This is empire builders had this strategy. You use collaborators to help you control the area. And Muslims were used by the Mongols to help in the running of their newly established empire. And those Muslims from Central Asia found themselves as advisors. Some of them were ministers within this Mongol ruling dynasty. The same thing applies with some of the Nestorian Christians who were also brought in by these Chinese ruling groups. And of course, this would lead to the development of major centers among these Chinese groups. And of course, that's why you have places like Huangsu, which was a prominent Muslim town during the Tang and Song dynasties. You have Nanjing, for example, is another cosmopolitan. In fact, some scholars would say it is the first capital city of the Ming Taisu dynasty, and the Muslims were very much placed in that area. And of course, it was this group that resettled many of the Muslims into the frontier areas. And they have the Xinjiang area of the south and west of the Taklamakan, desert in China. And of course, those Muslims also found themselves in that area. The city of Kashgar, or Kazi to Chinese, is the most important city for the Uyghurs, in China, because that city itself was named after one of their heroes who resisted Chinese influence. And of course, one of the sheikh of these Chinese Muslims who became a wife of one of the Chinese emperors came out of this town of Kashgar for the Chinese. Now, what is very interesting is that just like in India and in Africa, you also have this. Well, it is happening even in American civilization. We have Chinatown, we have Spanish Town in America today. Isn't that true? So you have this same pattern of distribution. It was not only done by the Arabs. The Romans did the same thing. They have their garrisons, you see. And so in the case of China, the pattern of residence was very much affected by the religion. So when the Muslims went to these towns I just mentioned, like Kashgar and other areas, the Muslims made sure that they maintained their side of town. And of course, in their side of town, they'll have the Jami Masjid at the center. Now, in the case of the Chinese, they have 4 different kinds of mosque. They have what they call the Eid Mosque, which was reserved exclusively for Eid prayers. So when they have Eid prayers, like the Eid al-Adha or Eid al-Fitr, they will go to that place. That's where they worship. And they have a Chinese name for it. Then they have the mosque for Juma prayer, reserved exclusively for Juma prayer. So Juma prayer, that's the place where they go for Juma prayer. But then they have mosque close to the tomb of their saints. And then they have musallas on the highway and in the mountains where they will pray. So these were the different types of places of worship in China. Now, if you look at the Chinese Muslims, just like in India and in Africa, you also have the divide between the orthodoxy, very literal interpretation of the religion, and the Sufi who were leaning on towards tasawwuf. You have the same phenomena. Now, those people who were seen as very Hanafi, because Chinese are basically Hanafis, Chinese Muslims are Hanafis. These Hanafis, they call them Khadimu. They take the Arabic word al-Khadim and they call them Khadimu in Chinese. So, those Chinese who came out of that background, of course, have this very orthodox Hanafi position vis-a-vis the Tasawwuf groups. And the Tasawwuf groups are divided into 4 major groups. You have the Kubriya, and you also have the Jafriya, and then you also have the Khadriya. Now, these different groups of Sufi orders among the Chinese are very much linked to Central Asia and to Yemen and the other Muslim groups. Now, these Muslims who found themselves in China also have different dietary restrictions, whereas in India, the Muslims who came out of Hindu background made that theological somersault by taking the position that, okay, you guys don't eat meat, we eat meat, so long as it's halal. Whereas for the Hindu, they will not eat meat. So you can now see the need for halal shops. One thing that is very interesting in Southeast Asia, more so than anywhere else in the Muslim world, is that they are particularly concerned about access to halal food. So in the case of in China, the Hui Chinese, who are half Han Chinese and Turkish, dominate butchery because they are in livestock. Now, if you go to Southeast Asia, places like Thailand, Malaysia, Burma, the Pushtun people, the Pushto people from northwestern province of Pakistan and India, they dominate butchery in Southeast Asia. That's why if you go to places like Thailand, in Burma, you find many of those people who came to the region and in Malaysia by virtue of the British expansion, make sure that they have halal food. If you go to Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, and all those areas, you will see halal food. The Chinese do the same thing. And one way of distinguishing themselves from other eateries controlled by Chinese, they will have La ilaha illallah, they will have Muhammad, Rasulullah, or Allah. So even if you don't know Chinese, you recognize Allah. Even the illiterate Muslim knows what Allah is, because they see that in their masjid all the time. They see the crescent. So in China, if you go to the major Chinese cities like Beijing, where you have 40 mosques, in Beijing alone you have 40 mosques, you will find eateries where you will have halal food. In Shanghai province and in Gansu provinces, where you have many mosques, you will have many eatery places where you can get meat, halal meat. You also have what they call Saikhana, tea houses, where you will get this.